review. Here's the purpose statement, right? We can see the language is clearly indicating the topic. And then we can see the summaries of the sources, right? So the writer uses a correct in-text citation. The only limitation, I would say, the only weakness with this proposal is if you divide your literature review into two sections, you should have more than one source in each section, right? Remember, you need 5 sources. So if you divide your literature review into two sections, one section should have 2 sources, another section should have at least 3 sources, right? Maybe this student only has 1 source in this section, which if you're going to say I'm going to look at all the research related to this topic, just 1 source doesn't really seem to be giving a complete overview, okay? But the writer does a good job of connecting the sources to his own point and clearly explaining how this source information helps to explain the topic that he introduced. Okay? Then we have the next topic, right? The writer tells us the next topic of the literature review is looking at creative solutions that can measure or test the elderly driver's physical reactions and cognitive functions. Then we have some studies that have been done related to this topic. We can see the in-text citations here. So that is good. Maybe we can see another source here. So here, the writer uses 2 sources. Again, just remember, you want to make sure you have 5 sources total in your literature review, okay? But otherwise, the writer does a good job of using the sources and connecting those sources back to that purpose and clearly showing us how those sources relate to the purpose. So that's a good example of a literature review in that sense. What about this next section? What moves can we see here?
Because before that I saw the move to the end of the literature.
Oh, right. Maybe I moved to that.
It starts with however.
Right. So, good. Maybe here we can see, just like we said, words that show a contrast, however, and despite, to introduce move to, right? And then we can see other similar words that it has continued to be a problem, right? So emphasizing that despite these methods, this issue is still a problem. So here we're kind of identifying a gap. There are some solutions that have been implemented, but this problem is not going away. It's still getting worse. So we can say that this indicates a gap in the previous research, that the current solutions are not totally solving the problem, right? And then the writer introduces a shift that, okay, this previous research didn't solve the problem completely, so we need a new strategy, right? So we can see move 2, very clearly stated. What about in this section? We can see a good transition. In order to address this elderly driving problem, we have a summary phrase here between paragraphs. And then, maybe the purpose here is stated. Redesigning and supplementing the self-diagnosis program, which has already been validated, is necessary. So saying, this is the next step. We need more research on this, right? So then we have an explanation for why. Why do we need to redesign and supplement the current self-diagnosis program? We can see the limitations here. And then we can see a really clear statement emphasizing the design proposal through this study is to create an application for this accurate test to be available in the daily lives of older drivers, right? So by using the words this study, the writer's clearly telling us, now I'm telling you the details of my study. Before, I was talking about the limitations of the previous system. Now I'm telling you what my study is proposing, right? So it seems like a small thing just to say this study, but if you don't use this kind of terminology, it becomes really unclear that now you're talking about your study, okay? Maybe talking about sort of the benefits of this proposal a little bit here. So the purpose, right? Basically, we have the study, the purpose of the study, and now what is happening in the next paragraph? Which move?
3A method.
The method, right? So here the writer is telling us all of the different ways that will be used in the study in order to achieve the goal or to answer the research questions. So we can see maybe 3 steps for the methods. An interview survey will be conducted. And the writer says, okay, what's the purpose of this interview? To find out how many older people are familiar with platforms that could be used to include the sort of the self-diagnostic test for the drivers, right? So the writer, this is a good method. The writer, before creating an application for elderly drivers to use, the writer wants to make sure that the elderly drivers actually can or are willing to use an application like this, right? You don't want to design an application for older people and then find out that none of the older people use smartphones or none of the older people use applications, right? So the first step is to find out if elderly people will actually use this, right? Then the second part of the method is to analyze and simplify the current self-diagnosis program, right? So the current test is long, maybe 40 minutes. The test needs to be simplified. So this is his second step. I'm going to simplify the current test. And the last step is to evaluate and develop the usability of the design application. He's going to use these principles. His method is to use these principles for interactional design to evaluate if his created platform is good, right? So he's saying, these are my 3 steps. This is a good example of how you can test your proposal, right? So his proposal is to design this application, and he's saying at the end, I'm going to evaluate its efficiency based on these 10 principles, right? This one is also a little different because it's a design proposal as opposed to a research proposal. So it still follows the same format, but because it's a design proposal, it just looks a little different. Usually you're talking about the effectiveness of the design as opposed to maybe your research study, right? But you can imagine the same exact thing would happen if you had a research question. You would want to say, what are my methods? And make it clear how your methods will allow you to answer your research question, okay? Does anyone maybe have an example of what kind of method you might use for your research paper? So think about your research question. How would you test that research question by using a general description of your method? Any ideas?
For me, I think like, I'm going to actually, but my topic is about autistic students and statistics and anxiety. Maybe I will like take two samples of students who take statistics courses, and the second one is also taking statistic courses, but like um, with help, or for example, with
So yeah, maybe in your case you might, a couple options, it depends just what you're testing. You could have two groups of autistic students taking statistics and compare them, maybe one with assistance and one without. Or you could even have a third group of students who aren't autistic and see if there's any difference.
Yes.
It depends. It just depends what you're focusing on. Maybe you're just focusing on helping autistic students, and in that case, just having two groups of autistic students is enough to see what helps reduce their anxiety, right? Or if you want to see if maybe autistic students aren't getting enough support compared to other students, maybe if they have more anxiety than a regular student, then you could compare autistic students to a group of non-autistic students, right?
Yes.
So it just depends what you want to focus on. But at least it's a test, right? You're setting up two groups and you're evaluating their anxiety, maybe through a survey of some kind or an interview.
Maybe interview.
So you could say, maybe I'll interview them, and you don't have to include all the questions on the interview, but you might just say, I'm going to interview them about their feelings of anxiety over the course of the class. Maybe you can say how often. Are you just going to interview them once? Are you going to interview them every week? Is it going to be through the whole course? So those are all things that you would want to think about in your method. But at least in that case, you have two groups, so you can compare your results and see if one group has less anxiety than the other. So maybe your research question is something like, in this study, I will examine whether additional support for autistic students reduces their anxiety when taking statistics courses, right? That is a testable question because you have two groups, one with support, one without support. By the end of the class, you can see if the group that had support has less anxiety than the group that didn't have support, right? So that would be a good example of a clear method and also a testable research question. Okay? Good. Okay, let's look at the rest of this. So we have the method. What about the value of the research? Do you think the writer tells us in this proposal about the value of the research? Move 3D.
It says the last step
Yeah, last
is to
one.
evaluate and
So if this application is developed, it will be a significant countermeasure to the growing number of elderly drivers traffic accidents. So basically, the writer's saying this research could help reduce traffic accidents for elderly people. So that's definitely the value, right? Obviously, fewer traffic accidents are a good thing, right? So the writer has all parts of Move 3. Introducing the topic of the proposal, the research questions, talking about the method that will be used in this proposal, and also talking about the value of the research. So this is also a good example of Move 3 and how you can fully explain each part, particularly the method, right? And then, of course, we have the reference page at the end. One thing I will say, you just want to check it, right? You can see the writer has author's last name, first name, last name, first name, last name, first name, but then we have first name, last name, first name, last name, first name, last name. So obviously the writer maybe made a mistake with this one. It's easy to check. You just have to make sure you follow the formatting consistently for every source. Also, these kinds of things with the spacing, you want to try to fix those issues so that it looks very uniform. But it is good to note that for APA style, the author's name should be on the left, and then the second line you can see is indented. So here's the author's name, the second line is tabbed over, right? Good. Any questions about that example?